Now, according to a recent article on a report published by ActionAid, wealthy nations cost climate change, but Africa suffers most despite low emissions. Now, the ActionAid report says that rich countries owe Africa $36 trillion in climate debts, yet little has been paid. Most climate finance comes as loans worsening Africa's debt crisis. They say that with South Africa leading the G20, Africa can push for fairer climate financing because cities need grants, not loans, for climate adaptation. Now, addressing climate debt is key to Africa's growth and global stability. We all know that. And to speak more on this, we have Desmond Majekodunmi, a climate change expert in Lagos, Nigeria, and also Deborah Fadeyi, Energy, Climate and Sustainability Specialist in Abuja. Thank you so much, gentleman and lady, for joining me. All right, now let's get to it. Let me start with Desmond. Now, looking at this ActionAid report, which says that wealthy nations owe Africa $36 trillion in climate debt. Yet Africa receives just 5% of global climate finance. What do you think this is all about?
Well, it's just a manifestation of what has caused the problem in the first place. Because it's not as if people haven't known that the massive pollution of the atmosphere is not going to cause a breakdown of the very capacity of this earth to supply our basic life support systems. People have known this for decades. And in 2015, we were clearly warned. The alarm was blown very, very, very loudly when the Secretary General of the United Nations in Paris said that mankind is waging war against nature, and this is suicidal because nature fights back. And then everybody said, oh, yeah, okay, we'll reduce. And then 10 years later, the reduction didn't happen. In fact, it went even higher. So it is typical of what we have been doing to each other and what we're now doing to our planet. Very, very, very typical and absolutely, totally unacceptable, particularly because it's no longer a crisis, as they said in 2015.
Yeah.
It's an emergency.
It is an emergency. Now let's hear from Deborah. We hear the term climate debt, right? But how do you convince the world that this is not just a moral argument, but an economic and legal obligation?
Yes, so I think as Mr. Desmond already mentioned, Africa is in the front lines of this crisis, not just Africa, the world. And it's so saddening to hear that Africa did not, contribute to this catastrophe that we are facing, but is faced by the worst consequences ever. And I think this sort of debate in itself is not even about the guilt, it's about the justice. And I think having to look at it, that climate debt that we are, striving to get is not even a moral plea. I think it's a fair strategic value exchange for Africa. If industrialized nations externalize their environmental costs while, building their economies, then that debt is obviously real and long due by the looks of it. But I also think that the truth is, having to rely on that aid alone will not deliver climate resilience for Africa. And Africa needs to, shift the paradigm to look at how we can move from that sort of victim approach to a place of agency and a place of opportunity, right? To move from that place of, oh, you owe us, to a place of building climate capital. I think we do not necessarily need to get stuck in that narrative of being wronged. I think we need to lead with what we can offer as Africa. If you take a look at China, for example, China in itself rose to global power, not just by relying on aid, but they did it with the fact that, they have resources, they have, opportunities to that they can leverage to be able to do that. So we need to sort of move past that dwell of relying on aid to see how Africa can do the same, just like China did. And I think Africa is an embodiment of solutions. We have the largest carbon sinks, we have natural ecosystems, we have critical materials, we have one of the youngest, fast-growing population on Earth. And I think these assets can fuel that green industrial revolution that we want. I know, I get it. Africa is hurt. We've been asking for this money. We've been begging, we've been pleading, we've been trying to show them the moral side of it. But is that enough to move the dial? I don't think so. So Africa must move from like that pain to purpose, where Africa is not just a passive recipient of climate finance, but it's using what it has to unlock shared opportunity, going beyond the pledges, taking advantage of fair access to carbon markets, depth for climate swaps, bold, innovative finance. And I think that's where Africa needs to get to.
All right, now speaking of bold, innovative finance, Desmond, we know that developed nations had pledged $100 billion per year in climate finance in 2015, and then increased it to $300 billion at COP29. Yet they haven't even met the original target. How much faith should African nations have in these promises?
Yeah, well, as our sister said very, very clearly, that we shouldn't just be relying on the promises of the West. And sadly, one of the major things that is preventing us from being able to extricate far more than that kind of money from the industrialized nations is our lack of unity, our lack of cohesiveness in the African continent. Because as she rightly said, within this continent lies the major natural solution to this massive problem, which is reaching a crescendo. And this is where we need to tell ourselves very, very clearly that when the scientists and the world meteorologists, and they come together and they agree, over 90% of them tell us that there is a window of opportunity that is rapidly closing, beyond which we shall be unable to stop the process of the degeneration of the climate until it reaches catastrophic proportions. This is an alarm call, and that window of opportunity is not longer than 15 years. Even if we stopped the carbon pollution right now, we'd still be very close to missing that window. And Africa has the solution. It is the green continent. South America is already there as well with the solution. If we can come together as Africans and demand that this must happen together with the South African nations, we could see the beginning of a very, very interesting process where people are coming together for a common cause and where we're putting people ahead of profit, and the planet is also there ahead of profit. So there's a lot of hope, but it will only be realized if we can get over this nonsensical attitude of me, myself, I, and all these quarrelsome attitudes that we have, and all this egocentric grabbing of the powers and the reins of leadership, that I must be the leader, I must. Nature is basically just telling humanity, forget it, get over that nonsense. And Africa, once we can learn that, and I'm very, very hopeful, because my sister there, she hit the nail on the head when she said that we have the youthful young population, and the young Africans, they're going to surprise the world because they're communicating now. Knowledge is pouring in through the various systems. And when they realize the challenge ahead, when they realize that we have to come together, they're going to come together. And we're going to see some great changes coming about. I'm very optimistic.
Okay. Now, Deborah, according to this report, no country has industrialized without burning fossil fuels, right? And Africa is urbanizing faster than any region in history. Now, is it possible for Africa to grow without repeating the mistakes of the past, when even rich nations still rely on oil and gas?
Yes, absolutely. I think we are at a point, at a trajectory where there is so much knowledge. There is another way to achieve industrialization, which is leveraging a different kind of energy mix to be able to do that. We have that knowledge, and it's something that we can leverage. However, we do not have the infrastructure or the finance or investment to do that. And I think that's where Africa needs to collaborate, as Mr. Desmond has mentioned. So if you look at what a term I call public-private philanthropic partnerships, if we need investment, this could serve as an avenue to de-risk that investment, to allow for infrastructure, sustainable infrastructure, for us to be able to, achieve sustainable industrialization. And it also would help us scale up projects faster. And what do I mean by this sort of partnerships? If you look at the global north is looking to achieve net zero, particularly with bit sectors like aviation, shipping, and research has shown that they would do most of that. They will achieve net zero with out of sector abatement. That means there is a desire, a need, a urgent and emerging need for high quality carbon credits and environmental commodities, right? This is where Africa can take charge and say, you know what, we want to build sustainable infrastructure. We want to leverage sustainable industrialization for our development. If you give us, if you offset our the carbon through this initiative, you literally just pay us for that, and that's an avenue for us to be able to attract finance and make finance flow to help to deliver this initiative. And I also think that when it comes to climate finance, to help to deliver sustainable industrialization, Africa needs to rethink how policies are being implemented and the kind of authority that is being meted out. So if you look at local governments, for example, in Nigeria, you realize that less than 10% of the global climate finance reaches local levels. And I think that's a major gap, because local governments are the closest to the people. And if they are overlooked, then that means that, you'll not be able to encourage things like localized entrepreneurship or even localized infrastructure for climate resilience, like access to water or electricity. So I think that in itself could, be leveraged to achieve the bottom line.
Okay. Now, Desmond, still talking about Africa urbanizing at an unprecedented pace. Nearly 1 billion new city dwellers are expected, that projection is actually expected by 2050. Now, we're seeing climate disasters already hitting African cities. How much will it cost to build resilient infrastructure, and who do you think should actually pay for these infrastructure?
Yes, well, we can do a lot of that internally. We have the materials to build infrastructure that is far more resilient. In terms of the building materials, the most vulnerable areas in Africa are actually the coasts. The dry areas, the desert areas are vulnerable, but it can be tackled far easier just by massive tree planting campaigns, which need to be done, diligently. We've undergone this before. A couple of decades ago, large amounts of money, at least in Nigeria, definitely were allocated. And unfortunately, the few trees that were planted didn't survive. And some of the people who were in charge of the funds, they were able to plant large mansions for themselves. So we know what that pertains, what that's all about. So the accountability has to be there. It has to be there. The people who are responsible for putting the various resilient infrastructures in place, they have to be held accountable. So the desert can be persuaded to go back if there's enough diligence in terms of regreening and giving the people the opportunity to do that. We're seeing some good results these days. There's a couple of organizations, some of the NGOs like the Nigerian Conservation Foundation. They're doing community activity in terms of, tree planting, and they're being very, very selective on the types of trees that will have commercial value and so on. So the desert area is a lot easier for us to take care of, to push back the desert. It's the coastal areas that are the big challenge, because most of the African coasts, definitely in Nigeria, are very low lying, very, very low lying. And already we're seeing massive amounts of erosion on our coastal areas. And to hold back the sea, it takes a lot. We do have the materials. There's these rock groins that you can put in place. We just, did a successful sea pushback in a place called Victoria Island in Lagos, which had been almost washed away. And it's been very, very effective. But it's expensive. There again, the finance has to be forthcoming. But when the finance comes, it has to be judiciously spent. The corruption aspect, which it can no longer be tolerated.
What about the profitability aspect?
Sorry, what about the
profitability aspect? Funding.
The sustainability.
Profitability, trying to make profit.
Okay, the profitability aspect. Yes or no in the long term. But the reality, you see, it's a very harsh reality that we have to come to terms with. That, what good is money in a dead planet? And businesses will be totally wrecked. They're already feeling it in different parts of the world where we're having these, onslaughts coming from nature. The whole insurance industries in the United States, for instance, they're in complete turmoil because they can't carry the loads. So the reality is that some of it will not be profitable, but then the question can be arised, do we need to look at profitability when we're looking at saving our children's lives? Which is what it boils down to. It's as serious as that. Humanity has never had this type of problem before. But again, the very, very bright silver lining on this extremely dark cloud is that it can, and I do believe it shall, bring humanity together with a change of attitude, a renewal of our minds, that we shall become far more caring, far more compassionate people on this planet. And if we don't, the consequences will be horrendous. And then when we can stabilize it, we can now look at, okay, how to make it profitable without putting the profit ahead of the people and the planet.
Okay. Now, Deborah, back to you. With South Africa now leading the G20, do you think that this is Africa's best shot at pushing for real climate finance reform?
Yes, I think it gives us a shot. And I also think that this initiative is not just symbolic in that sense. I think it's strategic because for the very first time, an African nation will chair, one of the most powerful economic bloc. I think it's a game changer. And I also think that this is Africa's chance to move from, just taking up an agenda to setting the agenda, especially on climate finance. Right now, African countries are borrowing, to establish climate finance. There must be someone that pays for the reparation, and South Africa can lead the charge to enable that to happen. And I guess with having to redefine climate finance, we can now push the G20 to adopt climate vulnerability as a metric in how, development banks, for example, lend. And in terms of unity, as Mr. Desmond mentioned, we need like a solid integrity compact that ensures that Africa gets fair value for the environmental commodities it generates from just having to, engage low carbon initiatives to and deliver sustainable industrialization. So take, for example, with Lufasi in Lagos being like one of the largest carbon sinks, you could get carbon credits for that. leveraging nature-based solutions really would make make a difference. And it's so interesting because Africa has so much like Africa is a green continent, right? But it's just exploring 2% of the global carbon credit value. And I think that in itself is something to think about, right? You have so much resources that you're able to, exchange for value. But instead you want to, beg. I think Africa needs to move from that. And I think this G20 summit would help us rechannel that narrative to enable us to be able to, get what we truly deserve rather. And we also need to talk about trade, right? With the rise of green protectionism, Africa needs to understand that it can set itself as a leader. Africa owns 30% of the world's critical minerals. That alone, are building blocks for like solar panels, electric vehicles, battery storage. Africa can, leverage that to, support itself to becoming that global leader, right? Just like China did in itself. So South Africa really should help the entire continent to rally for some sort of Pan-African climate finance pact that ensures that we are blending not just the trade bit, the investment or innovation. We are also blending in aid as well under one vision of sort of climate sovereignty, right? And it's about leveling the playing field really. If Africa has been given the megaphone through South Africa, then I think it's time for us to just speak through it and ensure that we are speaking for the entire continent.
All right. You've spoken very well, Deborah. Now, in a few seconds, Desmond, while we wrap up, if nothing changes and if Africa is left to struggle with debt, urban crisis, and also worsening climate disasters, what kind of future are we looking at? Briefly, please.
The future still looks very, very, very bright because we are the repository of the vast majority of the mineral resources that the whole world needs in this modern age. And South Africa, which is now G20 host, is also the larger repository place in Africa. So it's just a matter of, the young people. There's a youth quake that is happening. And even with my gray hair, I'm still inside that youth quake. And my sister, Lady Deborah, she's part of it. There's a youth quake happening. It's going to happen in Africa, and we're going to lead the world to a better place because we have it. We have the resources in our soil, and we have the resources between our ears. There's something so special about this continent. All we have to do is just get over all the old things of quarrel and fighting and all this, come together to make the world a better place. Africa is going to lead that.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Desmond Majekodunmi, a climate change expert, and also Deborah Fadeyi, energy, climate, and sustainability specialist, for joining us on the conversation and speaking so in-depthly and passionately about this.
Pleasure.